Welcome to AiArthritis Voices 360. We're so happy to have you joining us at the table today. We have a special episode. We're doing a pilot episode here, testing out a new series we hope to launch and keep it going strong called RheumyRounds. My name is Tiffany. I am co-hosting today with Kelly. Kelly, why don't you say hello?
Hello, everybody.
And Kelly and I are both co-founders at the International Foundation for Autoimmune and Autoinflammatory Arthritis. So we are also people living with these diseases. I myself am diagnosed now, which time with non-radiographic axial spondyloarthritis, prior seronegative rheumatoid arthritis, lupus has been thrown in there before, Sjogren's, all kinds of things. But Kelly, you also have diagnoses.
I think right now they have it listed as rheumatoid arthritis, but I've had psoriatic arthritis. I was called lupus light for a while. I don't know what that meant, but it's like Diet Coke, I guess. And then, so now I'm sticking with rheumatoid arthritis, fibromyalgia, Graves' disease, just a hot mess over here.
Oh, okay.
There you go. Lots
All right.
Stuff.
Well, before I talk a little bit more about what these RheumyRounds are, let's meet our guests today. We have a couple people joining us. The one is Dr. Alfred Kim, who is my rheumatologist. Hey, Dr. Kim.
Hey, how are you doing?
And then we also have Jerik, gosh darn it, Jerik. How do you say your last name? I didn't ask before we started.
Oh, it's all right. It's Leung.
Leung. All right. And we have Jerik Leung. And Kelly's going to tell you a little bit more about their backgrounds.
Okay. Well, Dr. Alfred Kim is an assistant professor of medicine and of pathology and immunology at Washington University School of Medicine. He also founded and directs the Washington University Lupus Clinic. Dr. Kim's research group is focused on addressing the unmet needs of the human systemic lupus erythematosus, SLE, including understanding and leveraging of the biomarker potential of complement activation products, testing novel, non-invasive imaging platforms such as photoacoustics to detect lupus nephritis, understanding the relationship between sleep quality and lupus activity, and restoring eroded social support in patients with SLE. Welcome to Dr. Kim.
Thank you.
Welcome.
So next we have Jerik Leung. Jerik is a graduate student in the Master of Public Health program at St. Louis University, College for Public Health and Social Justice, focusing in behavioral science and health education. He's been involved with lupus-related health research for the past 4 years, beginning during his time as an undergraduate student at Washington University, where he met Dr. Kim and conducted a senior thesis project in medical anthropology, seeking to understand the primary obstacles of living with lupus from the patient perspective. This work and the necessity of the patient voice in guiding research and treatment priorities has formed the basis of Jerik's current work with Dr. Kim and Dr. Elizabeth Baker, who is a professor of behavioral science and health education also at St. Louis University. They are working on understanding and developing interventions relating to social support and impact on quality of life among those living with lupus using a community-based approach. After graduate school, Jerik intends to continue on in a career path in health sciences research with a specific focus in autoimmune diseases. So welcome to Jerik as well.
Thank you.
Welcome, and yay to the specific focus in autoimmune diseases. I have to do a quick shout out to that. So I'm going to circle back really quick and tell everybody a little bit about the vision here of RheumyRounds and how it came to fruition. We have patients that we asked to submit topics for podcasts, and a lot of patients submitted the need for communication improvement between the patient and the rheumatologist. There were a lot of different subcategories that came up, and it was that moment that we said, wow, there's so much that needs to be improved. Maybe we could do a whole series called RheumyRounds. And the whole concept of Rheumy is, first of all, because patients call their rheumatologists rheumies, but it also is a word that envelops the entire rheumatology community. And that could include researchers, that could include other doctors that work with the researchers. So we're trying to keep the scope broad so that we can include all of the relevant topics. This series would be aimed at improving communications between patients and rheumatologists and people in the rheumatology community. And the concept really mimics the way that we work at our nonprofit, which includes patients who use our professional backgrounds to facilitate conversations between various stakeholders and a global pool of patients. And those are people like us living with autoimmune or autoinflammatory diseases that include arthritis as a major clinical component. We also like to host these kinds of conversations because different viewpoints is vital to problem solving. And we like to say at IFAA that we are problem solvers. So in order to do that efficiently, you have to have all parties at the table and listen to those different viewpoints and invite other people after these conversations to then submit comments so that all voices and perspectives are considered. And then essentially we develop solutions and resources that matter most to everyone. See how that works? Isn't that fantastic? So that is how RheumyRounds was envisioned, and we welcome you to the first episode. Today's topic is improving patient Rheumy communication. With typically patients talk to each other about what's important to us and choosing or keeping, in some cases, the right rheumatologist, which often revolves around how our expectations are at the visit. Were they met? Were they not met? But do our expectations align with the doctor's goals for the visit? I don't know. Well, what's interesting about this today is that we do have Dr. Kim to give some insight on his perspectives, knowing he's one doctor. So he will give some insights on that. But we also have Jerik, and Jerik is participating in, what should I say? Participating in, leading, what's the right word?
Conducting.
Research.
Yeah.
What would it?
Conducting.
So Jerik is conducting research into this very topic. So not only do we have a conversation going, but we have some research to back it up. And we know all of you doctors listening out there like that a lot. So we're going to turn it back over to Kelly, and Kelly's going to talk a little bit more about the format, and we're going to have Jerik talk a little bit more about his research.
Okay, well, Tiff, I think you actually covered everything regarding the format that I had in my notes here.
Oh, well, because I talk a lot.
So, just right off the bat, we do have Jerik who's here to talk about the research that he's conducting on this topic. And Jerik, can you tell us a little bit about your research?
Sure. Yeah. So this whole topic and the interest in Dr. Kim's research group and social support started with kind of desire to understand the patient perspective, because it was clear from a scientist research perspective that the patient's voice was not well understood. And so one of the way that we did that was that we talked to people, we did interviews with people, and they were on purpose very open-ended. So a lot of the kind of guiding philosophy was to talk about with patients living with lupus, actually, specifically, so the research focuses specifically on lupus, but from what I can gather, from what I've listened to from your other episodes, and what I understand is that that there's a lot of overlap with the autoimmune, autoinflammatory part. That's kind of forms the basis of the main patient experience.
Mm-hmm.
So talking to people with lupus, we wanted to understand what people's path to diagnosis was, and also what the main obstacles in everyday living lupus was. And then from that, there was kind of one main idea that came out of that, which is that patients seem to have a hard time maintaining and obtaining sources of social support in their lives, and that communication both with their healthcare provider and with their friends and family seems to be a driving force in that difficulty of obtaining and maintaining social support.
Wow, I would say that's really spot on, not just with my personal experience, but also with all the patients in the community that I know through our work with IFAA, and also through comments that I receive on my blog as well. And I think that primary concern and that social piece, and being able to communicate both with your doctor, both with people around you, have you found any insight into, has anybody sort of stated, well, this is why, or is it that they don't have the support within their local community, or are they seeking relationships online to find support? I know that's how Tiffany and I ended up co-founding IFAA, because, we were kind of little islands into ourselves, and through social media, we were able to meet other patients. And I think, sometimes that can be a good thing with all social media. There's some great aspects of social media. And then you also get, it's very easy to sit behind a computer screen and type anything you want because you don't have that face-to-face interaction. So there can be some nastiness as well. And some people do drop out because you're not really friends with that person behind the computer. So have you found any sort of solutions or potential concerns that patients pointed out specifically in your research?
Yeah, so I think definitely what you brought up with online groups, that's an area that we're exploring. So using kind of technology as a means to seeing how people are using it currently to connect with other people, because as maybe you both know with your diagnoses, that with lupus, people, it's hard to plan things in advance. Mm-hmm. So having the knowledge capacity to connect with people online, you can kind of do it from the comfort of your own home, and at any point in time. It's so we're exploring that area and future interventions related to communication.
Right.
Related to communication.
And it's ever changing. I mean, I started in 2008, and really it was Facebook at the time. And there were support groups that popped up. And I think Tiffany and I can both say we were not very big fans of the support groups online, because you would say one thing and people would jump on you, or there would be this sort of snake oil salesman who would, oh, I did this and this is what you need to do. And it was even harder if it was a parent of somebody living with an autoimmune arthritis type disease, because parents want to do absolutely everything to help their children. And, they're afraid if they don't try something that this one person said in this group said is the absolute thing you must do for your child, they're very driven to do that because they don't want to miss anything. And I think patients themselves, I've tried many different diets. I've tried many different holistic approaches because I heard it worked for somebody else. So I think, the longer you participate in these groups, the more you're able to weed things out and find your place. But I think it takes a long time. Now we have Twitter, and, there's that whole cancel culture on Twitter, and things pop up and things can snowball very quickly, and you're dealing with a much larger audience. So I think you can get a lot of really good things, but it's finding those good people to follow and finding those good resources. And I think that's a really big piece that's missing from the community. And I think it's something that IFAA really tries to do, to connect people to good information. So have you noticed, have patients talked to you about anything with online, or do they prefer the in-house sort of support?
I think it's a mixture. We actually did, we've collected feedback in a few different ways, through focus groups, through surveys actually on this specific question, like how do people use the internet? Would they be interested in using the internet to do these sorts of things? And what it comes down to, it's a mixture. And I think it goes to a point where people, and this speaks to kind of one of the main aspects of living with lupus or similar types of diseases, is that you're going to need, if you're someone living with one of these diseases, you're going to need different things at different times. Right. And you don't know when that's going to be, when that's going to change, but it has to be available when it does change. So having the mixture of methods, the opportunity, for example, to maybe there's an events calendar or something like that on an online website, and you can organize in-person meetups to do things that maybe aren't specifically about support groups, which
just for some getting people, out of the house almost, and just being with people who understand.
Mm-hmm. Because one thing that we heard about support groups is that maybe it's not always positive to kind of talk about what's going wrong. Maybe you want to talk about something else, but just with someone who understands your experience.
Right. Now, and again, I think the other thing too, the online support, which can be beneficial if somebody who is really homebound, because there's so many you're genuinely too sick to go out, you have somebody to talk to. And you most likely can open up your computer and you're going to find somebody who will understand what you're going through. And I find often I can vent on my blog page and say, oh my gosh, my ankles look like elephants today and I'm feeling really lousy. And somebody will say, oh my gosh, that was me too. I understand. Where my best friend might say, oh, well, what can you do to fix that? Well, I can't always fix it. So I think that's important. And then also you had mentioned about communication also with rheumatologists and how that there were some issues with that. Can you elaborate more on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think the framing of this podcast actually hits on the point of the exact point that we saw, is that the kind of the expectation or the goals of the patient didn't always align with the goals or expectations of the physician, or that whoever's treating, whatever type of healthcare provider you're seeing for your condition. And so, it's one of the more common things that we heard was specifically about medications and side effects. So if I'm a patient, I'm saying that I'm coming in for a 3-month follow-up after a medication change. And I'm telling the physician that, I've had stomach issues or I've had food sensitivities since I started on this medication. But the physician might tell you, hey, that's not supposed to happen. I don't know why that's happening. Or they'll say that's not supposed to happen, and move on or something like that. That specific interaction is kind of encapsulates kind of what we heard is that of.
That's the main crux.
Well, something that I think is really interesting that you were both speaking of with the whole social media and online is, first of all, the idea of being understood. That's really the key element that carries through for the social issues, Jerik, that you were talking about, the social support. It seems like it starts because if a person living with these diseases, lupus or otherwise, cannot gain understanding from a doctor, and or maybe they do for their doctor, but they don't get it from their inner circle, their family, their friends. Online communities are a pretty hot button, and you get that feeling of being understood. And I think that you expect that to be translated when you go to the doctor. If your family's not going to understand, my doctor is going to, because they have the medical background. So I think that sets up a certain amount of expectation that maybe we could talk a little bit about. But the other thing about this is when we're talking about going into the offices, we hear a lot of things online. And so it could be, well, I did this medication and it worked, or, I tried this and it worked, or my Rheumy does this and so we hear a lot. And I think we carry what we hear from other people living with these diseases to the office as well. And I think all of that is our stepping stones to breaking open the discussion about our expectations, the rheumatology expectations. And if we don't understand those going in, how are we really going to solve the entire problem of communication? So in saying that, I know myself as a person living with these diseases, Dr. Kim is my rheumatologist. But I sought him out. So I had a lot of trouble getting a diagnosis originally back in 2009 is when I got my first diagnosis. But then after that, I moved to Phoenix and it all started over. And then that's when I was re-diagnosed with non-radiographic axial spondyloarthritis in the first place. But then I moved to St. Louis and I did something foolish. People out there living with these diseases, you should never do this. I didn't research my doctor. And I just went with what my insurance provider suggested. And she ended up telling me there's nothing wrong with me, refused my medication, and I started flaring tremendously. Needless to say, I did walk out of that office. And then I started researching and I found Dr. Kim. So I handpicked him, and I remember I had to apply, and he had to accept me. And I don't know, are you having regrets now?
No comment. No, I'm joking. It's wonderful to have you, actually.
So as we toggle this into the rheumatology offices, I'm just curious. We've talked a little bit about what patients expect, and we'll circle back with that. But Dr. Kim, what are the doctor's expectations when seeing a patient? I know it varies if they're a new patient versus if you've seen them a while, or the variation of their disease. So it's kind of a loaded question, but what are your thoughts about the expectations of rheumatologists in general? What are your goals when we leave that visit?
Right. So I think the most important goal for us is to determine what's actionable, right? So is the information that we've obtained from you during the medical interview and the physical exam sufficient to be able to then say, okay, there are certain laboratory tests that we need to order? Are there imaging studies? Or are there others, studies that need to be done in order to either support or rule out certain diagnoses? So we think of this as a very medical thing. Mm-hmm. And in preparation for this, the most important thing we do is review other physician records that have been sent to us. And I think you use a phrase, starting over, which is very, Tiffany, because this is very common. I think that, especially in rheumatology is a kind of a unique discipline in the sense that, to me, it's like psychiatry. There's no lab test for bipolar disease. There's no lab test for depression. There's no lab test for anxiety. These are clinical diagnoses. Virtually all of the diagnoses in rheumatology are also clinical. But what ends up happening is that a lot of physicians overinterpret the meaning of a positive test. If you're positive ANA, they say, oh, you tested positive for lupus. Actually, that actually sets the patient up for a potential conflict with the next provider that sees them, that's trying to interpret what that positive ANA means, right? Mm-hmm. So for me, I think the most important thing, and this is true for all physicians, is that reviewing the medical record gives us an idea of, okay, what are we pretty sure of? What do I need to confirm in the visit? And for me, and I guess everyone may be different, I'm trying to also understand what could be the potential mindsets of the patient as we start discussing the possibility that a certain diagnosis may not be right, or if the patient doesn't feel like they have that diagnosis, it actually may be right. And so we have to make sure that we're prepared for that conversation, right? But to the extent of starting over, I think this is very frustrating for patients, because you seem like you're answering the same questions over and over and over again. But a lot of this is making sure that the physician actually put it in the record right the first time. And this doesn't happen all the time, right?
No, it doesn't. And it one of the very interesting things, I know, Kelly, you had mentioned that one of the expectations of going into the doctor's office is strongly based on treatments often, and getting on the right treatment. And I know for myself that there has been situations where to get the medication that is best for me, or deemed would be best for me, or has worked best for me, there's been changing to say, oh, well, you might have to put on rheumatoid arthritis in order to get access to that. And when that happens, my charts go to the next doctor, and then it doesn't have the right diagnosis on it. And that is happening a lot as well. So this whole idea that, and I don't know, maybe you could weigh in on this a little bit, Dr. Kim. One of the things that patients have mentioned is that, well, my rheumatologists say it doesn't matter what treatment you're on, because they're all treated the same. You're just always going to start on X biologic, or a DMARD, or whatever the journey is, but it doesn't really matter, because it's all the same. So it doesn't matter what I necessarily diagnose you with. Let's just get you a diagnosis. We hear that a lot. And what are your thoughts on that? Because in our interpretation, patients feel that a true diagnosis is very important. So do you have any thoughts on that, as far as what's our expectation?
I think for 99% of diseases that are out there, the diagnosis is critically important. in rheumatology, I think what's really strange, and this took me a while for me to accept as a trainee, as a fellow here, is that the symptoms are actually supersede the diagnosis in the sense that if you have inflammatory arthritic pain, so an autoimmune etiology for arthritis pain, say in your fingers, regardless of what the diagnosis is, the treatment actually is relatively the same. And what's strange about our conditions is that I think we still practice, because we don't have the laboratory tests to give us the granularity to be able to understand that a certain symptom is because of a certain disease. All we can do is say, okay, their symptoms are consistent with an inflammatory arthritis that's most likely autoimmune in origin. We've confirmed with some lab tests and we've confirmed with some radiographs. And regardless of that underlying diagnosis, it gets treated the same. Now, I don't think physicians do a good job of explaining that to their patients. Again, going back to communication.
Communication, right.
Well, I could just say you did a very good job. Thank you, Doctor.
Pat myself on the back. But this is a real issue, and we can go into kind of the barriers for this later. But this is the single, probably the biggest complaint that we see. Actually, when we first met Tiffany, going through your chart, I knew there was some incredible utter confusion that you were experiencing, right? Even though we had never discussed, because I was confused too, right? But so what ended up happening was I just need to understand what symptoms were you having, regardless of the diagnosis, right? And really use that as the basis. And I remember when we first talked, I was like, we actually had this discussion. I'm not sure what you're diagnosed with, but the bottom line is that you have these symptoms. And based off these symptoms, then there's actually these medicines. Yes. So it is different than cancer, for example. The diagnosis, the tissue, which organ, the cell type that's affected, really important, right? But in rheumatology, we're so far from that. So that is, it's confusing. I totally get why it's confusing for patients.
The other thing, just as a summary too, you said at the very beginning when you were talking about, when we started talking about this topic, that the expectations of the doctors, really based on clinical, right? That makes sense. You're the doctor. And I think that a lot of when patients walk in, it's emotional. And when you've got clinical versus emotional, those are very different dynamics.
Right. So actually, I pulled up this quote by Dr. Kenneth Robinson. So he's president and CEO of the United Way of the Mid-South. And he actually made this comment that 8% of health outcomes are determined by social determinants, 20% through medical care. So social determinants, just for the audience, is essentially the variables of how your living situation, your working situation influences your health. So this could be income and wealth, power that, at work, but also social support, education, employment status, addiction, disability, all of these variables. There are dozens of these that influence health. So physicians, as classically trained, we actually don't know how to address social determinants. We know how to address the medical aspects. But so I think this is where Dr. Robinson's quote is it strikes very deeply in terms of how we execute medicine in 2020, is that the physicians are still largely stuck in that 20%, largely because that's what we're trained in.
Right. Most
clinics, and certainly me prior to meeting Jerik, I was totally ill prepared to deal with social determinant issues, discrepancies, disparities in that. So this is, I think, kind of one of the things we're trying to fix within our own lupus clinic is, how do we address these disparities in social determinants in order to improve outcomes?
Do you have anything to add to that, Jerik?
The way that I've heard a lot of people talk about this and what I found helpful, I think that what Al brought up with the 8%, 20%, that's a good way to think about it. But in addition to that, it's maybe upstream and downstream. So what the care that you get from someone like Dr. Kim at a rheumatologist's office, that's something that's it's proximal, it's very close to you as a patient. There's immediate change. But the social determinants, you can think of them more as upstream from the health outcome, because the care the treatments that you get from a doctor, those are going to have like an immediate health outcome, but fixing or addressing something that's more upstream, it might not have immediate health outcomes, but it's kind of like the medium in which medical care happens, and it's be foolish to ignore it, to keep ignoring it, I guess. And also the second thing is that Dr. Kim mentioned this how do we then integrate the concern for social determinants in the medical setting? And some things that maybe you two are familiar with that are, I think, are more popular in rural settings and primary care is this idea of a medical home, or integrated care. Just something like having different services that might be most necessary at a given visit that as a patient, say if you you're having trouble registering for Medicaid or something like that, there's going to be someone on site at your visit to help you do that. Or if you don't have transportation, there's going to be a way, the clinic is going to facilitate your transportation needs. Or if there's a behavioral health person on staff for the clinic to take on, what they call warm handoffs for behavioral health, like anxiety, depression. So same care that day in the same facility. So that type of thing, I think, is something that the lupus clinic it's a goal that the lupus clinic is probably aspiring towards, is having this medical home type setup.
I know that is something that, Kelly, you've talked about in some of your blog articles too, that is a desire
right.
of expectations to have a whole community working together, in addition to the primary conversation between the specialists, et cetera.
Right.
If you wanted to expand on that.
Sure. Well, I did have an experience where, I have several conditions with several different types of doctors. I have a rheumatologist, a gynecologist, endocrinologist. So in going to all of those people, most of my doctors were in the same medical system. My primary doctor, unfortunately, was not. So I don't think I realized how important it is to have that consistency of everybody being on the same page. And again, this is going back maybe, 10 or more years, maybe a little less. My blood pressure was up, and my rheumatologist expressed concern, and I would go to my doctor, and his physician's assistant would say, no, it's fine. My endocrinologist was concerned. And again, so it kept happening. And so prior to going on a new biologic, I knew one of the side effects was going to be increased blood pressure. That was a risk. And they had talked to me at my rheumatologist office about that being a risk. As a result, I made an appointment to try and be proactive. I met with my general practitioner's physician's assistant because I couldn't get in to see him. And he basically said, if we put you on any more blood pressure medicine, you will pass out. So I left feeling very defeated, and I left feeling sure that I was right, that there was a problem. And I was very defeated in the sense that he didn't hear me. But I'm not a professional. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not a physician's assistant. So I trusted him. I had been with the practice for a long time. Well, the day I went in for the infusion, my blood pressure was 160 over 110. And my rheumatologist, who I swear is my angel, literally, I'm in a building where there are several specialties, and she took me by the hand and walked me next door to the cardiologist. I realized in that moment, although I liked my general practitioner, I needed everybody to be within the same system. So having that idea of a home, I changed general practitioners. All of my doctors are in the same system, and I'm lucky. I'm near a major city, amazing hospitals. There's teaching hospitals, so we have a lot of research going on. We have a lot of stuff that happens in this area. So I'm one of the lucky ones, and I'm very aware of that. But I think, like I said, if I go and tell a doctor that something's really wrong and I end up in the hospital as a result because what I said wasn't listened to, then you're not going to be the doctor for me. And unfortunately, I did end up in the hospital, and it was a very serious situation, and I had some permanent damage from that. So I've learned, and through that tried to express to other patients, that you really have to advocate, because I think, like you were saying, there's different expectations when a patient goes to a doctor as opposed to when a doctor walks in. And I think when, a lot of patients get nervous, there's the whole white coat syndrome. And that's what I was told for the longest time was the reason why my blood pressure was so high. My general practitioner's person kept telling me, oh, you have white coat syndrome. You just get nervous when they take your blood pressure. So again, we've already talked a little bit about the goal that, our doctors have when we walk in versus the goal we have that we walk in. Is there any way that we can maybe pull them together a little bit more? Any suggestions? I know through my blog, I've written down, you go to the rheumatologist, you might not be flaring. You look great. Your blood work looks great. So document along the way. I take pictures of my joints when they swell because sometimes I can't believe how bad they are. I write down the days that I don't feel well. I try and give her as much information as possible because she insists I don't complain enough. And I insist, I'm like, oh, it's not that bad. But yet when they see me and my joints are so big, yeah, it does get that bad. So I think that communication piece is really, really key in knowing what to sort of talk about. My doctor and I have a really good relationship. I always tell her she's never allowed to retire or leave me. Because my last one did retire and left me. And it was a struggle, as Tiffany said, trying to find somebody. I also had someone who told me there's nothing wrong with you. And I said, oh, well, if there's nothing wrong with me, why are all of my joints swollen and red? And he said, I don't know. I was like, okay, well, you're not the doctor for me. But again, none of us really want to have anything wrong with us. So the talk about, none of us really want a diagnosis, even though we do want the diagnosis. We just want to know what's wrong with us. We want to be able to explain it to other people. And I think the social piece with friends and family is, since we can't always explain what's wrong with us, it's hard for them to understand maybe what we need. And I think that is a piece. Dr. Kim, do you have anything to add to that?
I think you bring up something very, that's really challenging for physicians, is that so particularly in psychiatry, in rheumatology, and also other disciplines where we have to, so I think the toughest job that we do is that we have to take the colloquial coming from the patient, translate that to technical so that we can apply what we've learned medically, which is taught technically, and then translate it back to colloquial to be able to have you guys as patients understand what the full intent of what we mean. And oftentimes that skill is, I think, oftentimes implied that it's going to occur during medical training. I can't actually think of any work that we've done when I was in medical school or even residency where we actually talked about when a patient says this, how are you interpreting that, right? And I think this also goes down to how good of a physician that he or she is being able to say, you know what, I need to work with much more granularity on what was just said in order for that piece of information to be actionable, right? Okay. And I don't know, I don't know how well this is done globally by physicians. I think this is something that I sometimes see some of our, especially young residents, they interpret what the patient says the way they want it to because they're time constraints, right? And sometimes you have to back up and say, listen, I'm not actually 100% sure that's what they meant.
And I do have to say, I think the time constraint is a big thing, and that's driven more by the industry and insurance than it is by, a doctor wanting to take the time. My rheumatologist, I wait at least 20 to 35, sometimes up to an hour to get in. And I know so many people get upset, and I don't get upset because I know she's actually listening to people. And the one day she came in on time and I was like, what's wrong? Why are you here on time? That doesn't happen. But I don't get upset about that because I do see that as being, she's listening.
Yeah.
And she's taking the time to explain. And I do think, as being someone who, all through school, I'll be working and I'm like, you know what? I wasn't prepared for this in college. I don't remember that day they mentioned that this is how you have to explain things to a client. So it does make sense. I think there's a lot to be said for, you have to learn things. And I think the communication piece as a speech language pathologist, I mean, that's my area of specialty. Reading between the lines is a very difficult thing. And that patient relationship, like Tiffany said, patients tend to be more emotional, and that can make getting your stuff across very difficult. That's why I really do recommend that patients document their concerns along the way, and almost coaching them on how to be a patient. Dr. Kim, do you have anything else to add to that?
I just want to add something about the time issue, because as physician visits are being cut shorter, right, it becomes a lot harder to be able to extract out meaningful information from patients sometimes, because oftentimes it is emotional and that needs to be expressed, right? But what ends up happening, especially for physicians who are deeply empathic, is that because there's so many patients now that are seen during a day, that actually causes emotional burnout for the provider, right? And add that with electronic medical record burnout, right? I think one of the biggest problems that we're seeing within our industry generally is wellness, mindfulness of physicians, and these are actually efforts here at WashU they're trying to actively address. Is that if you really want to emotionally invest into a patient, that's exhausting, but now you have to do it 20, 30 times a day. Each person coming up with different sets of complaints, or even very similar complaints, but it manifests and impacts that patient differently. How do you maintain your energy without feeling like, what, I just can't do anymore today or this week, right? So these are system errors, as you brought up, Kelly, that I don't 100% know what the solution is, because obviously this is a financially driven decision.
Right. And, that's just one of the many barriers that we have in terms of communication with our doctors. And I think, now my medical system is very much, everything is online now. So like I said, anything I say to my one doctor gets translated to my next doctor. So if my medications have changed or anything, all of that stuff is really taken care of when I walk in, and they just sort of review things with me. I know I was lucky enough to attend the ACR, the annual event, the Capitol Hill Day, and the one rheumatologist I went with, he is new to the Philadelphia area. And he's only been in practice there a few months. And he said there's already a 6-month wait for new patients. And when you think about that, that's 6 months of a patient not knowing what's wrong with them, reading lots of things from Dr. Google that scare them. All those things, really add to the whole emotional component. And I think that is a really important thing that patients have to really understand too, that listening to people all day long talk about being in pain is draining. It's emotionally draining. It truly is.
Right. Do you have something to add, Jerik?
Yeah, so I'll add, I think that what you just described with the blog and trying to teach patients how, skills, specific, discrete skills that they can use in their doctor's appointment is really important. And and a lot of the field and the communication skills training literature focuses on this and improving communication in doctors. There's been a lot less on patient-specific skills training. It's unclear to me why exactly, because communication is a two-way street, and it needs two individuals, the patient and the doctor, to work. And when we're talking about misalignment of goals, it's not that patient goal should be the most important. That's what I believe, at least. But I think the giving patients skills to acknowledge, and also because doctors are people too, and they also want to be validated or affirmed or made their experience relevant, and knowing that going back to the time, this is maybe they're not having the best day or something like that, but that's something that the patient is also responsible for addressing as well.
Yeah. No, that's interesting that you say that, because one of our goals of this whole RheumyRounds series is so that we can collect enough information to develop tools and resources that solve the problems that we're talking about. And one of the things that we do as a pillar of objectives is to utilize our experiences as people living with the diseases who have the opportunities to speak with doctors, who have the opportunity to go to the American College of Rheumatology meeting, or EULAR, the European League Against Rheumatism. And then from that and all of the information we're collecting and inviting patients to listen to these and be part of the conversation, then we can begin to really use our backgrounds to teach. And, Kelly has an educational background. I was a college teacher for 8 years. Several people who are affiliated with our organization have backgrounds in teaching. So we hope that becomes a reality. That's part of this goal. I think it's also a good transition into these final few talking points that we had, the barriers. So we mentioned the time. That's a big barrier. And Kelly, you brought up Dr. Google. And so that leads me to the question about what is it like, Dr. Kim, when an educated patient walks into your office? And I'm not talking about myself. Let's leave myself out of
Yes, the students of Dr. Google.
Because there is a whole variety of different education. But I think this topic really is what are your thoughts, and how does a patient translate the information that they want to in a respectful way that's not stepping on, your your profession and knowledge as a physician?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting to hear what Dr. Google says. I don't always Google the diseases that I treat. I actually rely on the patients to tell me what perceptions are out there. And I think this is important because one of the things we say in research is that anecdote, an N of one story is not data, and the plural of anecdote still not data, because there are always recall biases. There are emotional things that are attached to that. And so I think this is where the discordance, I think, when you said earlier for both, Kelly and Tiffany, I love how you say that the visit is emotional. And I think this is something that I need to remind myself when I see patients, because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say, okay, what are the facts? And then if each fact has a kind of a limited sphere of meaning, and anything beyond that is interpretation. ANA testing is a good example. A positive ANA test is a positive ANA test. It's not a lupus test. A lupus test would be an interpretation of that fact. All right. Mm-hmm. So what I'm trying to do at each visit is to make sure that the information that's being given and portrayed, what I try to do is educate the patient to try to understand what it is to say that, if it makes sense to me, but I can't really say why. Those are moments where you have to almost question yourself. So there are data showing that 80% of our assumptions are wrong. And these assumptions are largely driven because they make sense. I think there's some really good, there's a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He's a Nobel Prize winning economic behavioralist at Princeton. And he delves into, his Nobel Prize winning work was delving into the behaviors of economic decision making, which are often fraught with poor decision making because some of the decision making is based off of assumptions. And so I want to make sure that the patients that see me understand the divide, which is really challenging because oftentimes, if you feel like no one else has addressed a certain symptom and this website said they can address your symptom, that's a solution. I can't say if it's a solution or not. I'm definitely not going to say I'm going to discount it prima facie or I'm not going to accept it, prima facie. I will just say that, it is an option. We could explore it, but I can explain why this may not be the best option. All right. So I think this is where, to me, it's a learning experience. For other physicians, they're a little bit more time constrained than me. I can see it could be a source of frustration, mm-hmm. right? Because they're trying to say, one of the things I forgot to mention earlier is that actually from a medical perspective, I have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen in that visit, even before talking to anyone, because I've reviewed the records, mm-hmm. right? I kind of have an anticipation of how it's going to go and what to do. It's just a matter of getting to that finish line. So within there is going to be anecdote from the internet and some facts. A lot of it is emotion, right? But mm-hmm. I think for a lot of physicians, the emotional aspect is not necessarily actionable from a medical perspective. It's certainly actionable from a social determinant perspective.
Right. And
right?
that's I put a little timestamp on this because I just loved everything that you were talking about there. I think it's so relevant mm-hmm. because I'm going back to this whole emotional versus clinical. you're also dealing with the patient's history. So many of us have heard, well, it's all in your head. There's nothing wrong with you. And so especially those early visits that you have before you develop the relationship with the doctor, and even afterwards, it's almost like
it puts you on the defensive when you walk in.
It's like anything in life. You have your experiences drive your emotional reactions, right? So if you have a history of a rheumatologist saying something to you, that worry or that I know for me, I always worry that, oh, what if I'm finally doing better? Because I've had experiences where I do better on my medication and then I'm told by a new physician, well, I don't see anything wrong with you. You shouldn't be on medication. And the reality is I'm better because of the medication. But I have that. Now that's drilled in my head that is a fear that I can't seem to get rid of. Thank goodness I found a good doctor that I don't think will do that to me.
I think, these experiences, and you mentioned this earlier, Kelly, but this is not just shared with a lot of patients, is that part of the self-management of being a patient with a chronic illness is learning how to advocate for yourself.
Yeah.
I find that so pathetically sad that has to occur, right?
And there's advocacy within so many different parts of the system as well, with your doctor, even with the receptionist, with insurance. I'm fighting with insurance now over something that I just do not understand, but it's that advocacy piece. And again, that's nothing. I always say I wasn't a little girl and planning to grow up to be a patient advocate. I didn't even know what that was. But when I got sick and I didn't know what to do and I started seeing all this other stuff going on, I was like, wait, somebody has to learn how to do this. So luckily I found Tiffany, my sister from another mister, and we were able to put something together. But I think you're right. It is very sad because these things, it's so multi-layered and there's so many different things. And I think the most important thing that I think patients need to realize is that, doctors are people too. I understand we're all going through pain, but, there is no simple magic pill. And, the doctor I was with at the ACR, I mentioned something. I said, I'm so sorry. I feel so foggy today. My brain is just brain fog. And he said to me, you know what, can I ask you a question? What is that? What does it feel like? And I was like, that's something everybody talks about. And I tried to explain it to him the best I could. And he's like, I just don't know what it would feel like. And I hear patients say it all the time, but I've never experienced it, where I've experienced pain. So I can wrap my brain around that. But what is the brain fog? And I was like, wow, it's all about painting pictures in somebody's mind of what something is. Because again, there's no clinical test that says, oh yeah, she has brain fog.
That's an interesting point in itself, Kelly, because brain fog is historically associated more with lupus, right, than the other diseases. However, I do not have lupus, and I experience a lot of bouts of brain fog. And that's we did a study in 2013, the early symptoms of AiArthritis study between 6 diseases, lupus being one of them. But it didn't matter which diagnosis the patient had. At least 30% reported experiencing brain fog within the first 12 months of onset. Yeah. So it's a real issue. And that just brings in the whole communication and opening the door when you have this little minimal window of time and talking to a rheumatologist. I don't know, would a rheumatologist even believe me because it's not associated with lupus? So it's those kind of things as well.
Or even worse, maybe the physician never experienced it, right? So the other thing that's really striking is that there are a lot of physicians that aren't patients, right? Yeah. And it's very confusing to me because if you are going to do something, you have to experience first, that. But a lot of physicians largely are healthy. There are certain ones that have had medical issues like cancer or whatever, and so they've gone through a cycle of where they understand at a much more intimate level what it means to provide care in a more global sense. I wondered that of the physicians that don't necessarily have experienced a medical illness that's relatively severe or chronic, how are we supposed to actually understand we can try to be as empathic as possible, but it becomes challenging because now you're working with assumptions, right? And I love how the example of Kelly, how your physician asked, what is brain fog, right? And that's a great example of that clarification, right? To make sure that your physician understood specifically how this impacts you.
And you know what else was interesting that I thought, because I said it to somebody else and they went, oh my gosh, how could a rheumatologist not know that? And I was like, no, it was I don't expect anybody to know all the answers. And the fact that he actually had the guts to say to me, what is it? He wanted to know. He was seeking that knowledge. So I think, again, the patient I was when I was diagnosed in my 30s is not the patient I am that I'm now 50. I've grown with it as well. And I think doctors do as well. But I think we all hit visits at different points. And I think, unfortunately, they become natural barriers that I think nobody is really aware of or nobody talks about. So again, relationships with your rheumatologist, I said, I've kissed a lot of frogs in the rheumatology world, and they're going to have to drag my rheumatologist away from me kicking and screaming. So, those things, the thought of moving, that's a scary thing for me. But that exchange of information is really important, really,
Jerik,
really important.
Jerik, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just sticking on this anecdote with this rheumatologist who asked you what brain fog is, also that that person was comfortable admitting that they probably could define what brain fog was, but just being comfortable with understanding that that's one way of knowing what brain fog is. And then the patient side is another way of knowing that's equally as valid as the way the rheumatologist would understand it from a clinical perspective. And I think a lot of doctors aren't necessarily comfortable being in that space where they're no longer the expert, because that's kind of the way that medical education works here, is that you're trained to be the expert in the human body and physiology and disease and everything. And when you're put in a position saying, oh wait, I actually, I'm not the expert anymore, just so inviting others to share perspective and knowing that your perspective as the doctor is not the only perspective. I think that is really well highlighted in that anecdote.
Yeah. And I do want to stipulate this. He isn't my doctor. He was a rheumatologist I was doing an event with. So that's where, I wonder if I was his patient, if that question would have come out as well. But again, we were communicating on a totally different level at that point.
Interesting point. You weren't in the doctor's visit.
This wasn't my rheumatologist. And it's also funny. I will go in, my doctor knows that I attend the ACR events and that I advocate for patients' rights. And I do advocacy for the ACR, the American College of Rheumatology. And, she'll sit down and say, hey, talk about this. These are some key things. And she said, I can't believe I'm talking to a patient about this. And I think it's because she might have, I think I'm the only one in her practice that does advocacy. And again, I live in a very populated area, but again, that patient advocacy piece is so foreign, to a lot of people. So, you don't speak up, the doctor knows everything. And I think, we're all growing, especially in this field, because it's not clear cut. We're not clear cut. Like I said, I call myself a hot mess because there's so many things going on and managing all those things. And I know when I go in, I forget to say things. So that's why I think it's really being prepared to go into a doctor's appointment is important.
Great segue. Because
I'm good like that.
Yeah, I was going to ask the question is we've talked about a lot of the barriers and some things like advocacy, being a voice for yourself. And of course, we understand that we have to work as a community to develop some tips and some resources because we don't have all of the answers yet. This is just an opening discussion. What do we know that does work? What are, like, Dr. Kim, what if you could define a great patient communicator, what would fall under that category?
I think the most important trait that I see is a patient who truly understands themselves and their symptoms. In our society, largely, we're very we apply hyperbole all the time. And I just did it right there, right? It's the best thing ever or the worst thing ever. And sometimes when that happens, it kind of emotionally myself, I almost discount that, right? So I want to know truly how does it impact that patient, but also if the patient is able to give some granularity to a symptom, they say they're achy, right? That could be anything, and it could be hundreds of different diseases right off the bat. So if the patient is able, and we are helping the patient prompt them, trying to get into that granular aspect about, well, where does it hurt? Let's start off with the hands. Does it hurt in the hands? Sometimes patients are like, well, I don't know. I'm just thinking, okay, so what I need to do, and this is going to take time, won't be that visit, is to be able to get them to think about more details about their health, have a stronger relationship between them and their own body, right? Because that ultimately, end of the day, is the most important pieces of data for us as rheumatologists to act on. So sometimes it does require patients to have a much more heightened awareness of what's going on with them. And it's usually those then that communicate better, whether it's natural or with some prompting, with some additional questions from us. But if they are able to think about it at a deeper, a more specific level, that helps immensely. And that's where a lot of communication issues from a medical perspective tend to basically get addressed.
What about specific tools? Printing out, well, I had shared this one on social media not long ago. I have it sitting right in front of me. This was how I got diagnosed. So this is my actual chart that I made myself from 2007 to 2000. It has the exact dates of every area of onset. So some doctors I've heard think those are great. Some just I've experienced it. Some have laid it off to the side. I've had rheumatologists tell me I don't look at photos. Some say photos are great. So what about tools? Because I ask for the sole reason that in the patient population, the patient community, when we're sharing tips with each other, that's what we tell each other to do. So are we right? Suggesting that?
No, I think I love tools. It's sometimes hard to review them in the visit because then it takes me away from actually being able to clarify things with the patient. So what I ask our patients is if they have something like that, or if they want to send in a list of things they want to discuss at a visit, send it to me a week before.
Ooh.
Right? So where I have a little bit more time and I can put more thought into it. Right? Because, if I'm supposed to, if someone says, I have 12 things I need to address, and one of those 12 things is related to disease, and 11 of the other things deal with their quality of life, and I only have 20 minutes to see them, and on top of that, I have to make sure that their medical aspect of their disease is in a remiss state that makes me feel more comfortable having them leave the door. That becomes a lot. That's too much pressure, and I think that erodes the communication, bridge.
And that goes right back to what you said before, Dr. Cam, about your goals and expectations moving into one of the visits is planning. You plan. You said, I know a roundabout idea of what's going to happen because I plan, I read. So that is a great tip to circumvent back to the tools and the kind of information that we'll obtain from this conversation. So thank you so much for that. Kelly, did you have anything to add?
No, I would love to be able to email some things ahead of time. I don't know if every rheumatologist has that capability, but that might be something I'm going to ask when I go in.
Okay, great. I had one more question to sort of visit, but before I do, is there anything else that Jerik or Dr. Kim you wanted to add to any of the points that we've already talked about?
I found it interesting, Tiffany, that you found me through research, because I think there is actually a real paucity of online resources that actually work when you're trying to find a doctor. But I know in New York City for a brief period of time, there was discussion about putting physicians on Yelp. And there was a huge backlash amongst physicians. They didn't want to be evaluated colloquially. They want, I don't even know what that means because the current, metrics that are out there, it's all colloquial anyway. I mean, it's the patient's experience. So in a way that almost is saying, I don't want to know what the patients are telling each other, which is insane to me. But, something that we had talked about within our own lupus clinic is, do we go on Yelp? Because it's such a common platform and that they can just go in and they just could type in what they want, in an environment that they're used to, right? They do it for restaurants. They do it for any other service. Why not physicians? I'm sure there are a lot of physicians going to be like, it just is a slippery slope, and they can list a lot of good reasons why this shouldn't happen. I just can't think of them right now.
Right. Well, I can tell you that it's only in the United States because I have looked to see if this site is international, and I'm interested from people listening if there are sites like this in other places. But Health Grades is where, and by the way, right before we got on, I did look, Dr. Kim, and you have 5 stars.
From like one review?
No, there's a few, and I have not reviewed yet, so I will go in and review. But that's one of the places I know that I went to review. And interestingly enough, the rheumatologist who I did not research, but when I initially moved back to St. Louis, I looked up on Health Grades, and she had 1 star. So had I done a little bit more research, I never would have went to her in the first place. And interestingly enough, the things that I found disappointing were all listed by the patient comments. And so, but we do talk to each other in communities. I can't tell you how many times I've been in an online community and somebody will say, hey, does anyone have a recommendation for a rheumatologist in XYZ city? I know there are some organizations that have lists of recommendations, but I don't know how patient preferred they are, or how if they're patient recommended. But yeah, I researched because I failed to do so for the first time, and I ended up with a frog like Kelly had, and it was not a good experience. And speaking of not good experiences, there's the last question I wanted to touch on. When is it time to part ways? When is it time to say, this isn't working? And I think in our community as patients, we talk about this a lot, but it's fair, I think, for rheumatologists to accept the fact that maybe there's not a good dynamic as well on your end. We use the word fire a lot, fired my Rheumy. And that I've done that. I know Kelly has done that. And that just means that we were fed up for whatever reason, and we left. And that's what it means. We don't literally say to them, you're fired, you're out of here. What are your thoughts about that, Dr. Kim? It is a two-way street.
So Jerik touched on this earlier, but I think ultimately it's trust, right? Does the provider trust that the patient is doing everything in goodwill and not intentionally self-defeating, right? And vice versa. Does the patient trust that the physician is doing everything within their own power to be able to address issues? The emotional, social determinant aspects are often neglected. And before Jerik joined our research group and did his research about social support erosion, I was guilty of that too. But the reason is because I was never trained in it. So I never thought to even recognize it as something that needed to be addressed. So now, so actually what's interesting is that I still don't know how to address it. I just know how to recognize it. But what we are able to do in our clinic is we were able to bring in an occupational therapist who helps with essentially improving the experience of living with disease. And so for lupus patients, oftentimes it's learning how to improve your self-management, which will help to lead to increased adherence to medicines and visits. It's learning how to deal with brain fog and cognitive dysfunction. It's also related to caregivers too. How can caregivers learn to provide the adequate support? Not that every resource can be, or every issue can be addressed, But what I recognize is that since I can't do it, I need to find someone who can. Mm-hmm. So that is the other level of trust from the patient to the physician, is the patient needs to say, listen, I heard all over and you keep ignoring it. This is my complaint for the last 6 visits. I just want to know, is there anything we can do about it? And I like you, but if we can't necessarily fix this problem, can you at least point me in a direction that allows me to address this problem? All right. And so oftentimes physicians ignore things or don't address it. Ignore is too strong a word. Don't address it simply because we're ill-equipped to handle that specific issue. Oh. Right. Mm-hmm. And so if it doesn't fit within our ability, our skill set, for example, if someone came in wanting treatment for small cell cancer of the lung, poor outcomes, right? And, it's just, I can't help them, right? So that problem persists even medically. Mm-hmm. Right? So for me, I just want to make sure that I know when my limits are hit, and that's my own honesty to myself. And then when that's hit, I need to figure out a strategy to get them so that it can be addressed professionally.
That's a great recommendation, because I know that one of the bigger reasons that we hear patients, a couple, leave is the listening, which we've already covered. I'm not being heard. They're telling me nothing's wrong with me. But the other one is treatment expectations and not meeting those. I know, Jerik, you had seen that in the research, correct?
Yeah, and it came up a lot with specifically medications. And when new medications are prescribed and patients feel like they're led to believe a certain thing about the medication, that it's going to affect these symptoms, but it doesn't. But the doctor's like, well, it doesn't. It's not. It just the patients. Ultimately, patients feel like they're kind of led to believe certain things that don't end up being true, and that's just erodes trust.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Maybe a speech language pathologist can help with those to help people communicate better. Ooh, I'm forming my post-retirement speech therapy career here.
So actually, you bring up something that's interesting, because I'm also thinking back to medical school. I was never really trained to speak with patients, right? Mm-hmm. You're just thrown into the situation, and they have an inherent trust that you're going to figure it out, which leads to incredible diversity of patient-physician interactions, I think.
And also, how do physicians then learn to talk to patients? It's from the people senior to them. And if the people senior to them don't speak well with patients, they're going to continue on. So there needs to, I think the big takeaway that I want to communicate is that do specific skill trainings, both for doctors and for patients, that agree with each other. Because I think that's, it's very broad, but I think, this podcast and the work that you both are doing really speaks to the patient side. But I think you're also helping communicate with having people like other physicians, including Dr. Kim on the podcast, communicating about their perspective. This is all in that vein. So
absolutely. That was perfectly said, by the way, Jerik. And I think it also goes back to what Dr. Kim said earlier when I asked, what is the ideal patient that comes in? And he just said, you've got a variety. Some communicate well. And that's the same with doctors, right? I mean, we're all humans underneath it all. And we all have different skill sets and different social skills and communication skills, and that just plays into it naturally. And that's something that we also have to consider. So I think that we have covered everything that we wanted to speak about today. And I just want to reiterate our thanks to both Dr. Kim and to Jerik for coming and speaking with us today and having all voices at the table. So thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Our pleasure. Thank you for inviting us.
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely. And just as a reminder, this is an episode that we are turning into a series called RheumyRounds. If you are a Rheumy or in the rheumatology community and listening out there, you can sign up if you want to be part of future discussions. be on the show or just submit some ideas or comments offline, you can hit more details at aiarthritis.org/RheumyRound. See how easy that is? Patients, you also can join discussions about this on our social media sites. All of the podcasts, this and others, will also be available to view on aiarthritis.org/podcast. See, we're just so good with that. Just boom, boom, boom. And also you can learn more about being a co-host on the show, submitting your ideas. And if you love the show and you want us to keep moving on, then please consider a donation. Otherwise, we just thank everyone for joining us and taking a seat at the table. Together, we are stronger. Thank you, Kelly, and thank you everyone for joining us.